So, hello. First, I've got some remains of a cold, so please excuse the occasional coughing or sneezing. I will try to keep it to a minimum, but it could happen. So I'm very happy to be back, and it's great to see that there are so many new people in here, and also, of course, a few recurring ones. I hope you will enjoy today's session. We've got a lot to cover. So let's keep this quick. Just a few words about me, who doesn't know me. My name is Daniel, and I live about 50 kilometers south of Munich in Bavaria. And I'm a freelance 3D artist, and I like PlantFactory especially because I specialize in node-based structures, so PlantFactory was a natural fit. I've worked for more than 10, or I believe 12 years even, with both softwares. And I also delivered a couple of presets and content stuff for PlantFactory and Vue for Eon. And today we are going to model this red poppy flower as a project-based walkthrough. And I'll give you an outline of what to expect tomorrow in the second session. And for today, this is how we're going to approach this project. First, we'll do a quick recap of the very basics of TPF. I'll keep this pretty short because there are still recordings out there from the other webinars that cover the beginner and advanced stuff very deeply. Then we will start with modeling the stalk of the flower. Then we'll continue with adding the leaves and adding hairs to the flower. Then we'll add secondary so-called side stalks that grow out of the side of the main stalk. Then we'll model buds that will be attached to the side stalks. And then we'll continue to the back to the main stalk, and we'll add the capsule in the middle and the seeds. And then finally, we'll be exploring the flower node that was added in PlantFactory 2016 release 5, and which was refined in release 6. And we will use this flower node for modeling the final petals. And if time allows this, then we'll also have a look at tweaking wind. If we run out of time, we could probably get back to tweaking the wind animation tomorrow. And Paul already said it in the chat box. I'm really looking forward to your feedback, so ask questions at any time, and I will get back to all of those questions during the question and answer slots in between. And just tell me what you'd like to see. If you want me to focus a little bit more on something that we just saw, or if you want to drive a little bit left and right, then if time allows for it, I'll be happy to do that. Okay, so let's get started with PlantFactory. As I said, I will just quickly recap the very basics on how to work with PlantFactory if you've never actually seen the software. Before I do that, how many of you have actually used the software before or know the basics so that I know how much I need to tackle during the webinar? Could you just give me a quick feedback? Okay, I see 2 people raising their hands. Alex has used it a great deal. Luke hasn't used it at all. Okay. Just wait for a couple more people. Okay, I see. Most of you have actually some experience with it. And there are a couple of you who haven't used it at all. Okay, so I think we can move at a average pace today, since we're having a mixed audience. Okay, so just to give you a quick easing into the software, PlantFactory is mostly node-based. So this means that you use building blocks for creating your plants. These building blocks are located in this left toolbar, or alternatively, you can do a right-click and select them from the geometry group. In contrast to regular 3D modeling, where you would extrude polygons to create new geometry and then bevel the edges, etc., you don't directly work within the 3D view that much. Instead, you sort of use hundreds of settings for each building block to deform that geometry into something that resembles a tree or a flower. I'll give you an example. So we're going to add this advanced segment, and we need to connect it to the origin, to the world origin of our scene, which is the root. And now we have a cylinder in our 3D view. And as I said, you cannot directly manipulate the polygons in here. Instead, if you select that node, you have different tabs for editing the geometry. So for starters, let's take a look at the length, for example. So currently, the length along Z, since the Z axis is up in PlantFactory, is 10 meters. So if I enter 5 in here, we just made the cylinder shorter. And we can also set the radius of the cylinder. For example, let's set the radius to 1 meter. So the diameter is twice the radius, 2 meters. And if we reduce the radius, then the geometry changes as well. So how do you actually deform that cylinder into something that resembles more, something more like a trunk? Well, you use these orange curves for that. These orange curves, these filter curves, are here for actually changing the influence of each setting along the axis that runs through the geometry or along the height of the geometry. So this is the bottom of the cylinder and this is the top. So by moving that curve down, we can make the cylinder more narrow at the very top. And let's just try some more extreme shapes so that you get an idea for how these settings work. So this is how we can actually start to deform that basic geometry. And we can already see that our resolution is not sufficient. It looks pretty angular, that model that we have right here. So we need more polygons to make that shape rounder. And the great thing is that since this is all generated by the rules that you set in here, everything you do is totally non-destructive. This means you can add polygons on the fly and subdivide this model a lot more or unsubdivide it again, depending on how much resolution you need. And there's also a setting on the transform tab for each node where we can just boost that one plant part individually. So if we had more than one plant part, for example, branches, etc., and you just want to boost that one plant part because it doesn't have enough detail, then you can use this mesh resolution boost. Okay, so now let's assume that we're satisfied with our great looking trunk. And it's time to add some branches to our tree. So let's add another segment. This time I'm going to do a right click and add another cylinder. Let's call this branches. And let's connect this to our trunk. And I'll rename this to trunk. And you can see immediately that we now have several copies or instances, as they are called, that are growing out of the trunk. And if we go back to our trunk, we now have a new tab that just appeared. And this tab lets us and allows us to control the placement of these new instances, of these branch instances. So for example, if we'd like to have 10 branches on our tree, then we can enter 10 in here and we can define where the branches are supposed to start and where they are supposed to end. And we can change the angle of growth of these instances. We can rotate them around the tree, etc. So this is how the basic principle works. You use different kinds of nodes that you connect to each other, and this enables you to add geometry on the fly and control as many copies as you want. Now, there's that plus-minus field that appears when you hover over a setting. It's present for almost every single setting and every single node. And this allows you to enter a variation into each setting. So if we select our branches, I think 10 meters are a little bit too long. Let's reduce the length to 3 meters. And now let's say 3 plus minus 2. This means that PlantFactory now chooses any length between 1 meter and 5 meter. So we just added randomization to our plant. And by indicating this kind of variance behind each and every field, you will be able to generate countless copies of your species just with a click on that new plant variation button. And each species will look different. Each instance will look different than the other that you just had. And this way you can create unlimited variations of the plant that you just created. And finally, one thing that I'd still like to show you is that green curve. So what does that actually do? Let's reset that rotation so that we have our branches in parallel. And I'll also remove the variation so that all branches have the same length. This green curve allows you to change the influence of a setting not along its length or height, but along the position from where it's growing from the node before. So in this case, things that grow out of something are called a child, and the geometry from where it grows is called a parent. So we're currently editing the influence of the parent on the length of our branches. So to give you a better idea, I'll reduce that curve down. And now you can see the higher up on the trunk the branches are located, the shorter they get. So with the combination of the orange curves and the green curves and that variation, you start to model your plants. This is the very basic of PlantFactory in a nutshell. Any questions about that?
Okay, any questions so far on that in any way? Just pop them in the chat box. If you think of something in a few minutes' time, then by all means, put it in there. Okay, let's move on.
Okay, great. So then let's start with actually modeling our flower. So as I said, we'll start with the stalk. And for this, we're going to use a cylinder. Luke, you can indicate the amount of branches. So if you just want a single branch, then it's up to you. We'll have a look at that during the modeling process of that flower. I think it's going to become more clear then. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do in our new scene is change the unit from meters to centimeters, because we're working with flowers and not with trees. Or if you're more used to the imperial system in the US, you can also, of course, use feet and yards and miles. But in my case, as a European, I'll stick to meters and centimeters. So let's go to the program options and change the unit to centimeters. I was a little too quick. You can find the options for your scene under File and Options, and here you can set the unit. Now we can see that everything that we enter in here is interpreted as centimeters instead of meters. Okay, so this is our base cylinder, and if you look up poppies in an encyclopedia, you will see that they can grow from 20 meters up to 20 centimeters up to, I believe, 80 centimeters or so. And so we should decide how tall the poppy is going to be that we're going to build. And I, for one, decided to settle on a medium length. I'd like the poppy to be 50 centimeters on average. So let's enter 50 centimeters in here. And let's zoom out a bit so that we can see the entire plant with this button. And now for the variance, you can either enter a value in here that corresponds to centimeters. So for example, 50 plus minus 10 centimeters. Or, and that's sometimes a little easier to do, you can click with the left mouse button on the name of any setting and change the type of randomness from absolute, so in this case centimeters, to relative, and relative is a percentage. So that can be a little bit easier to visualize sometimes. So we just changed that variance field to percentage, and let's make a variance of 15%. And if we click our randomize button, we can now see that we get different lengths of our stalk. Okay, so now we need to deform our cylinder so that it doesn't grow in a straight line. So for this, I will switch to that Influences tab. And the Influences tab is basically a deformation tab. So you can twist something on this tab. You can curl things. You can bend things. So everything that you can imagine for deforming that straight running axis through the cylinder is to be found on that Influences tab. And for the beginning, I will have a look at that axis perturbation. To show you what I mean, if I switch to that touch-up tool, we get a gizmo tool. So this is a little more similar to what you're used to from other DCC applications. So you get your transform gizmos, you can switch to other gizmos via keyboard shortcuts, for example, the rotation gizmo, etc. So one thing that you might not directly see at the moment is that there is a spline, an axis running through our cylinder. And you can also add control points by doing a shift click anywhere in here, and then you get tangents for deforming that axis. And the thing that I'm doing right now is manual deformation, but we want this thing to vary, so we need an automatic solution. So I'd like to remove these changes that I just did. So I'll do a shift click again. Maybe a shift and right click, or yeah, shift and right click. And this will actually remove these control points that I just added. Okay, so now we're back to our default axis. And instead of manipulating that axis in 3D with our mouse, we can use this setting, which will add noise to that axis and deform it by that noise. So let's increase the strength and see what it looks like. So it looks pretty strange, and that's of course not what we're going for, but you can see what that setting is actually doing. And that frequency in here is actually the scale of that noise. So by I believe by increasing that frequency, the noise actually gets smaller instead of bigger. Let's see. And by using something like this, yes, then the noise gets larger. So the smaller the frequency setting, the larger the noise gets scaled. Now, the thing is that I don't like this noise in particular, because if you look at it down here, let's zoom in a bit, it's pretty angular. And a poppy has soft curves. And so it's better if we could influence that noise, and fortunately we can. So everything that PlantFactory uses internally, for example, this noise is something that you can access as a user. So you can go as deep as you want. And in this case, the noise is hidden behind that frequency setting. So what I'm going to do now is I'll do a left click on that setting and click Connect Parameter. What now just happened is that we extracted that noise as a separate node into our graph, into our construction plan of our plant. And by clicking that plus button down here, we can unfold our stock, and we can see all the settings on all the tabs and unfold all these settings if you want to. And we can connect something else in our graph to that setting and control these settings by something externally. We'll come to that later. But for the moment, we can now see that in the axis perturbation group, our frequency is now controlled by this. And this is called a meta node. Now, what is a meta node? If you're a view user, then you might know this. A meta node is nothing more than a group of nodes. And you can click Edit, and we will go to a new graph, and we can see the contents of that meta node. that TPF actually uses. And here is our noise that TPF uses. It's a chip noise from the cellular patterns noise group. And the chip noise generates very rough edges, and we'd like to have a softer deformation. So let's change the noise type to a simple Perlin noise, and here I'd like to use a gradient Perlin noise. And you can immediately see that we get softer curves in here. And that's all we need to do. So let's save our changes and let's get back to our main plant graph. And we can now influence the frequency, so the scale of that Perlin noise. And I'd like to make it just a tiny bit larger. So let's go to 0.05. It's just a very subtle change, but of course you can play around with whatever you'd like. And of course, the strength of that deformation is much too strong. So let's go to 1.5 and plus minus a strength of 1. I'll just switch to that gizmo tool again. And there's that keep tip setting in here. And keep tip means that the noise is not going to deform the very end, the tip of that geometry. And since we don't want the flower to point downwards, for example, and we always want the blossom to point upwards in the sky, I'll increase that keep tip setting a little bit to something around 0.5. And let's add a variation of plus minus 0.2 to that thing. And finally, I think I intended to use 0.5, not 1.5, if I'm not mistaken. Plus minus 0.1. Not really helping. Okay, we'll get back to that later. Maybe I wrote down the wrong settings. Okay, so let's call this stock for the beginning. And next, we'd like to bend that stock into a certain direction because currently it's only deformed in one axis, if you can see that. And we still want to make sure that the stock itself doesn't grow up in a straight line. So let me see. For this, we're going to activate a deformation setting, and this is called a local bias. So in here, we can define several different types of deformation. For example, if we define swirl, we can make our stock swirl, but that's not visible at the moment because the geometry is not fit for that. But just to give you an idea about that twist bias, let's move the meta node for a moment. Now it's working. Okay, so the reason why things didn't work as I wanted was that the manipulation that I did in the 3D view was reflected here. So everything you do in the 3D view is also going to be reflected in these settings. So in this case, we had that axis setting active. So instead of using that 3D view, you can also use this editor to deform things. And I just reset that axis, and now the things are back to normal. So that's what we want. Okay, so in this case, we want to curl our stock. So let's change the type to curl. And I would like the curl to work in local coordinates. So instead of using the world axis, since we're going to copy that stock later and make it grow out of the sides, I'd like to use the object coordinates, the local ones. And let's increase the strength and see what that looks like. Well, not much going on. Why? Let me have a look. I think TPF doesn't like me today because it's supposed to be working. Maybe I'll just try a new scene It seems that things are buggy at the moment. Something that rarely happens with PlantFactory. So let's get back to our curl. Let's reset our units to centimeters. Yes, Murphy's Law, definitely. So let's reset our length to 50 centimeters. And let's add 15%. And let's set the radius to 0.45. And let's give it a try now. Local coordinates. And let's zoom out a bit. Yes, now it's working. No idea why it wasn't working before. Okay, but now you can clearly see that our local bias is working. Yes, I'll connect the meta node in just a second, Tom. Okay, so we can use this to actually make our plant curl into a specific direction. And 0.25 is enough. And I'd like to have a maximum curl of 0.5 or no curl at all. So that's why I'll add another variation of 0.25. And now let's use that orange curve to actually restrict the amount of curl along our axis. So in this case, I want the curl to happen mostly at the bottom of the stalk, and I don't want the curl, or I want the top to curl into a different direction. So let's move the top down to -1, and this will invert our curl strength. So you can now clearly see that at the top it starts to curl to the right, and at the bottom and at the top it starts to curl to the left. Let's click OK, and here we have our curl. Okay, so now let's reconnect that meta node, and let's change our noise again from that chip noise to our Perlin noise gradient. Let's click OK, and let's reduce the frequency to 0.05. And now let's increase the strength. Okay, it looks a little better. Deep tip was set to 0.5 plus minus 0.2. Okay, so now we're back where we were before. Okay, so I'd like to use a second local bias, and this time I'd like to not curl it in a spiral way, but simply bend the plant into a certain direction. And so the type direction is fine. The strength of 0.5 is also fine. And let's activate local. And we're not going to see much of this as of yet, but this is going to change once we're going to copy that stalk and make it grow out from the sides. So this is basically preparation for later parts of the webinar. Okay, so now about texturing. Let's switch to that materials group. Basic texturing works as follows. The geometry is divided into different parts. So the segment body is basically the outside of our cylinder. And then we have dedicated groups for our caps at the top. Lates is something that we're going to be exploring tomorrow. And so you can load dedicated materials either for the circumference of the segment or for the top. And by default, each node will inherit the material from its parent. In this case, our parent is the root. So let's go to that root node and double click that preview to open the material editor. So what we're having here is the advanced material editor that you might know from Vue. So everything you do in here is procedural, And this means that you can create very elaborate procedural materials, but these are not exportable, and they will only work in Vue. So if you want to create plans for other applications, then switch to the basic material editor. And now you're limited to only those settings that can be exported to other applications. And by clicking Use Map in each slot, you can load the corresponding bitmaps into that slot and build the material that way. In order to save some time, I already pre-built the materials for that webinar. So let's load the stock in here. And if I do a double click, you can see that we have just some very basic low-res textures loaded in the color channel and into that normal channel. Okay, so let's go back to our stock. Let's rename this to stock. And now we need to define how we'd like this material to be tiled. And for this, we have that segment body UV mapping group. If we check parametric, then this means that the numbers that we indicate here represent the total amount of tiling along the length of our geometry. If parametric is unchecked, then this means it's going to be tiled once along U and V per centimeter, since the unit of our scene is centimeters. So I always like to work with parametric mode, but this depends on your personal preference. So let's check parametric. And I think a U-tile around the circumference of 4 works well. And along the height, the V-tiling, I'd like to use a tile of 10 times plus minus 2. And for plus minus 2, you might be asking, why am I entering a variation for the texture mapping in here? Well, simply because we also have a variation in length. And I would like to link the variation of the material to the length of our stock. So the longer the stock, the more V-tile we're going to have. So for this, I'll do a left click on the setting again and go to set randomness dependency. And we're going to use the length on the first tab, the segment tab, segment group, length. And now we have a green outline around the setting. This indicates that this is now linked to our length setting. So if TPF chooses a higher value for the length, then it will also choose a higher value for the V-tiling. And if it chooses a lower value, it will also choose a lower value for V-tiling. So this way we can make sure that when our segment gets longer, our texture is not going to be stretched, but it's going to tile accordingly. Okay, so I think that more or less concludes the basic modeling for our stock for the moment. We'll get back to that later. So I think we'll go through the couple of questions that we just had.
Yeah, you got one from Charon.
From Charon, yes. The curl is not for the wind effect, it's just for the general static modeling of the geometry. Wind effects are controlled separately to a dozen different settings. I hope we'll be able to get into that today as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Daniel, when you were researching poppies, did you find a great variety when you were looking at the reference photos? Was there a lot of variety of species with this flower, or was it a kind of quite a kind of stable species where you could say, oh yeah, this is how the stalk works, this is how the petals work?
I think the most variety can be found in the petals. And this is going to provide a bit of a challenge later today, because PlantFactory doesn't have any sort of collision detection. So we need to make sure that we get enough variation in the petals later on in the blossom. But the variation has to remain within a certain range, or we will get intersecting geometry if we create new variations of our plant. So that's more of the challenge that I saw when modeling.
Okay, yeah, we'll look at that later. Yeah, all right, thank you.
Okay, So for our curl, I would like to add a little bit more intelligence to PlantFactory. So currently we have a curl along the y-axis of our stock. But let's say we'd also like to bend into a different direction. So we'd somehow need a way to randomize that direction. So just to give you an idea, let's enter x as the bending direction, and I'll just increase the strength so that you can see it more clearly. X, Y, so you can see that it's bending either to the left or right or back and forth, etc. And so what we need is a random direction. And how can we randomize that direction? Well, we're going to build our own random vector, because basically what we have are 3 coordinates, x, y, and z. And so this is a vector. And we are going to use a couple of nodes to build a randomized vector direction. And then we're going to control the direction of our curl with this, so that each plant bends into a different direction and not always into the same one. So basically, I would like to create a random number for x, y, and z. So let's do a right click and go to the miscellaneous group and use the random range. So basically, the random range is nothing more than the random number that you see in here. You enter a number and the plus minus variation. So let's, I don't know, use a random range of 0 plus minus 10. And now we need to use this variation to create a vector. So we need to convert this number into a vector. For this, I'll do another right click and go to the math group, vector operations, and add a composer 3 node. So what a composer 3 basically does is that it takes 3 numbers, one for each axis, and creates a vector from these coordinates. So x, y, and z. And now we have a random vector, and we are unfolding our influences tab. And let's go to our local bias 1, which is that curl, and connect the direction to that composer 3 node. And now we just randomized the bending direction of our stock. And to make things a little more cleaned up, let's select both nodes and click the group icon, and we just created a meta node. And I'll rename that meta node to random curl direction, so that we keep our graph a little cleaner. And this one we're going to rename to stock noise, because it deforms our stock with noise. Also, what I'd like to do is I like to color the nodes that are connected in the same color. So let's use a dark green color for our stock. Excuse me. And let's copy that color to our 2 meta nodes so that we can see at a glance that they both belong to the stock. This is going to be very useful once we have more meta nodes inside our graph. Okay, so this concludes our stock for the moment. And so next up, we will model our leaf. So there are various ways for modeling leaves in PlantFactory, and I'll tackle all the different kinds of leaf nodes today and tomorrow. And for the moment, let's start with the simple leaf node. So I'll click that add leaf icon and connect the leaf to our stalk. And first, you can see that the material of our leaf, if I display the wireframe, we can see that we just added a couple of flat planes. The material of our leaf is inherited from our stalk, which is not what we want. So let's set this to load material. And here's the poppy leaf that I created. So it's a simple TIFF file with alpha channel and a normal map. And inside each material, you have that leaf icon. And this icon allows you to define the hooking point. And the hooking point is the point of the texture where it will be attached to its parent. So if we were to move that hooking point over here, then you can see what's going to happen. Yes, so it's now attached on its side to our stock. So of course we want to attach this in the middle. So let's move that down. Okay, so next up, we need to make sure that our leaf has the correct scaling. So generally speaking, the leaves are about 35 centimeters in length, which I researched when I built that flower. So let's enter the global size of 35 centimeters, which is of course way too big, but we're going to fix that in a moment. And I will change the randomness again to 25%. And sorry, it wasn't 35 centimeters, but 3.5. And so we're going to scale the width down to 0.1 plus minus 10%. So let's change this to relative randomness. And the length is going to be twice as long. So 0.2, again, plus minus 10%. Now our leaves look a lot better. Also turn off shadowing for the sake of clarity. Okay, so currently we have a flat polygonal plane for our leaf. And we now need to deform that plane into something that has a little bit more depth. So first, let's subdivide that plane by increasing that subdivision setting to 2 subdivisions along the length, the width, and 2 along the length. So we can now see that we just created more polygons for our leaves. And now we can bend this leaf along the middle rib. So for this, we have that mid-rib angle setting. And I'll set this to about 7.5 degrees. And you can now see that our leaf or our polygon just got a little bit of deformation, just a tiny little bit of depth. And now we're going to bend this along the width as well. So let's enter a variation of plus minus 20 degrees so that the leaf is going to bend either downwards or upwards, so randomly, either plus 20 degrees or minus 20 degrees. And now let's also bend this a little bit along the length. So I would like to bend this downwards quite strongly. So let's use about 40 degrees of downward bend. And so this is a good example where the leaf bends upwards, and further here it bends downwards, so plus and minus 20. And let's add a little bit more variation to this and enter a value of 20. So here we are with our leaves, and I think the leaves themselves look rather good. And so now we need to talk about the placement of our leaves. Just one remark in case you were wondering why do we only have a blue curve instead of an orange one. This is a level of detail curve. Down here you can see an LOD control where you can switch between different LODs for your plant that you can of course define yourself. And if you take a look at the polygon number, you can see that it decreases as I go through the various LODs. And that blue curve that you just saw in here actually says that with higher LODs, so with the highest LOD, the subdivision will go down to the lowest level. So if we were to reset this curve to something like this, then the resolution of the leaves is not going to decrease with a lower LOD. So this allows you additional control over the resolution of that node. Okay, now let's influence the placement of our leaves. So back to on our stock, we now have a new tab, which is called Leaf. No surprise about that. And so we'd like to place more than just 4 leaves on our plant. So I'll just have to take a look through my notes for a second. There we are. Okay. So again, we have a length variance of our stalk, and I would like to longer stalks to have more leaves than shorter stalks. So first, let's click on the number of leaves and make this again dependent on the length of our stalk. And I would like to use 6 leaves plus minus 3. Okay. Now the leaves are way too high on the plant. Usually they grow in the lower third. So let's say that the end of the growth should be around 35%. So let's move that down to 0.35 or 36. And within this lower third, the leaves are currently very regularly distributed. So the distance between each leaf is the same, and this is not necessarily natural. So let's add a little bit of variation into that placement by editing the density. You can see that the density is currently uniform within the lower 35%. And I would like to aggregate more leaves at the bottom of our stalk and less leaves at the top. So let's at a point around here, and maybe let's go down around 67%, something like this, and then a little more upwards at the end of our 35% range. So now it's more likely that PlantFactory will aggregate leaves on the very bottom of our plant and a little less on the final part of our 35%. I would also like the leaves to influence the shape of our stalk. So for this, I will go to the Influence on Segment group and activate the bending. So let's add a bending of 0.4. So wherever a leaf grows out of our stalk, we can just see that tiny little detail, the tiny little bending. And let's add a variation of 20% to this. And now we also need to add more than 1 leaf at the same height. So I would like to have a group of leaves at each height. For this, we can use that whorl setting. And this whorl setting will create more than 1 leaf. So by entering 3, for example, we now have 3 leaves per whorl. So TPF now generates 6 plus minus 3 copies of leaves and groups of leaves, and each group consists of 3 leaves. And for the whorl, I would like to have a variation of 1, so that we either have 2 leaves, 3 leaves, or 4 leaves, so that things are a little bit less regular. And I would like to have most leaves at the bottom again and less leaves on the top of that 35% range. So let's edit that filter again. And let's go to about this range and turn that a little down. And now you can see that it's more likely to have more leaves at the very bottom. Let's generate a new variation. And less leaves in a group on the top. Yeah. Okay, it of course always depends on the random variation that we're just working on. Yes, the stalk, Charon, is actually a little thicker for a reason, because we're going to come back later to that stalk and make it thicker at the top, and we'll thin it out everywhere else. So we're going to fix that thickness once we're going to blend the stalk with the petals that we're going to add. No, the groups are of 2, 3, and 4 are actually not gone. It simply depends on the random value that TPF chooses. For example, you can see that right here we have a group of 2 leaves. One is here, and this is the other one. Okay, so one final adjustment that we need to make is the growth angle. The leaves are growing not steeply enough from the plant, so let's increase the angle to a steeper one, around 85%, I believe. And again, I would like leaves that are located at the bottom of the stalk to grow in an angle that isn't quite as steep. So let's reduce the influence of that angle a tiny little bit. And I will move that down to about 60% of these 85 degrees, something like this. And now we can see that the higher the leaves are located on that stalk, the steeper the growth angle gets. And let's maybe add a little bit of more variation, plus minus 15. And finally, let's rotate each group like a revolving staircase in a spiral way around the stalk to get some additional variation. This is what's going to happen. If I move this around, you can also see how the shape of the stalk changes since we have that bending influence active. And I think we are going to use a coil of about 70 degrees plus minus 10 degrees. And I'll also like to add a little bit of randomness for the placement of each leaf in a group. So usually if we had 3 or 4 leaves, PlantFactory would space them evenly in a group. And by adding a little bit of randomness to this, we can make things still a little bit more natural. Or maybe let's leave it like that and add this as a variance. Okay, so this concludes the modeling of our leaf and of our stalk. Any questions? Charon, what is monocode and decode? I actually don't know these English words, I have to admit. Can you probably use another term? Ah, okay. I'm not a biologist, so that's why I didn't know that the expression.
I mean, I'm interested in all of the variations that you're thinking about here, because I think many of us don't really study plants up close and realize how much variation there is. And it's great to see how much variation you can apply in PlantFactory. You know, these details of the little twist that comes out of the, you know, as the leaves are attached to the stalk, that kind of twist that occurs as it comes out of the main stalk. All of those little details I've never really thought about.
Yeah, you can use quite a lot of variation. Maybe you're referring to the placement group, Charon. You can define the way that the instances are placed in here. So you can either choose orthogonal, which is not quite as visible at the moment because we introduced this additional coil angle. But with alternate, you basically get one leaf to the left, one to the right, one left, one right. So always one, then a few centimeters higher, the next one, etc. If you use pair, you'll get pairs of leaves on both sides. Actually, let me Let me demonstrate that to you by adding another geometry so that we can see this a little better. Okay, so let's increase number to, I don't know, 20, so that we get a better idea. So this is the alternate placement, one right, one left, one right, one left. And if I choose orthogonal, then all are located at the same side instead of alternate. With pair, we get exact pairs. And there's also the lateral option, which is not going to do much at the moment because the cylinders are totally symmetrical. But if we had a deformed shape, then you'd see that this changes the rotation of each cylinder. And you have also lateral alternate and lateral pair. Is that sort of what you were asking? Ah, okay. Now I see where you're coming from. Okay. I'd like to save that question for a little later because I think it will become more clear on how you model that kind of thing once we delve deeper into plant modeling. Is that okay with you? Maybe I'll get back to that tomorrow. I'll write it down.
Yeah, I'll keep a copy of that question too. Thanks, Charon.
Okay, I'll just write it down. Okay, so if there are no further questions, then let's get on with modeling the hares. So with the hares, I'll cheat a little bit and do something very simple. And we'll simply use a cylinder. Let's call this hare. I just need to get my correct notes. There we are. Hare. Okay, let's make this white since hares are also white. And let's connect the hare to our stalk. And now we have a new group on our stalk called hare. And let's first define the placement of our hare. So this time I will use the per length setting. Per length means that PlantFactory will use the length of the scene, in this case centimeters or maybe meters, I'm not entirely sure, and place 20 children, 20 instances per meter or a centimeter of a parent. So this is an easy way to create more children the longer the stalk is. So this would have been an alternative approach to that link that I created with the number that I linked to the length directly. But I wanted to showcase both methods. So we're going to use actually even 40 hares per length. And they should grow out from an angle of 40 degrees. And the coil should be around 15 degrees. These are all values that I figured out, of course. So now I can actually see what the coil setting is doing a little better. And I would also like to have more than one hare in a group. So let's create a group of 3 plus minus 2. So we either have 1 or 5 hares. Yes, I will use this plant both for close-ups and for ecosystems, and we will turn off the hare with LOD in a moment. So yes, it does make the plant heavier, but only if it's seen up close. From afar, we will turn off the hare. And actually, we can do that immediately. So let's go to that hare group. hair node and go to that Transform tab. And here you have the LOD management group. And in here you can define where each node should be generated, on all LODs or only on a certain LOD. And I will limit the generation of the hair only to the highest LOD, which is, or to the second highest, which is LOD 1. So currently we are at the highest LOD, LOD 0. Now let's go one LOD lower, LOD 1. And the hair is still generated. But if we go to LOD 2, it immediately disappears. So we just made the hair available for close-ups. And View will automatically use lower LODs in ecosystems the further away you are from the plant. So now we need to modify this so that it looks a little bit more like a hair. First, let's make this shorter. The hair should be between 3 and 5 millimeters. So let's add a length of 0.4 plus minus 0.1. And let's zoom in on our plant so that we can still see that our hairs are present. They're only invisible at the moment. We will fix that in a second. Now we need to change the radius type. Currently it's inheriting 50% of the radius from the stock, which is of course much too thick. So let's change the radius to a fixed value instead and use a value of 0.1. And let's go back to our stock. And let's change the placement of the hairs, not from the axis of our cylinder, because the hairs are now so short that they are inside of our cylinder. Instead, we'd like to move the placement of the hairs to the surface. And now our hairs are back again. But now we need to make that radius thin out of our hair so that we have a thicker root and a thin top. So I'll change the type of our filter to a spline. And now let's move this down so that things get thinner at the very top. And let's do like this. Click OK. And we need to increase the resolution a little of our hair. And now let's replace the material with a new one. So the hair is nothing more than a white bitmap. And in the material editor, if I switch to the advanced one, I added a little bit of transparency. And yes, it would be a good approach for thorns of roses too, Christian. That's right. Okay, so our hairs are looking unnaturally spiky. So let's deform our hair a little bit with our X perturbation strength. And let's add a variation of 0.05. Let's zoom out a bit. And yes, I think that looks a little better. Yes, and we also need to curl our hair a tiny little bit. And we should also reduce the radius, I guess. Yes, I set the radius to 0.1 actually. Yes, this looks more like our hair. Okay, so let's add just a tiny little bit of curl. Let's activate a local bias for our hair, change the type to curl, and let's use 0 plus minus 25. So that the hairs curl up in different directions. And I'd like to use this in local coordinates along the y-axis. Okay, so this concludes our hair, which is only visible when viewed from up close, thanks to that level of detail setting. Why am I using a bitmap? Yes, you could, of course, create this procedurally, but then you're limited to using the plant inside view only. If that is your goal, then that's totally fine. But in case you want to export the plant to another application, then you have to use a bitmap. Okay, so we're done with our hare. And now it's time to create a copy of our stock and create the side stocks. So I just copied our stock. And first, let's reduce the length of our stock to 20 centimeters because it's going to grow out of the sides of our main stock. And they should also be a lot thinner, simply because in contrast to the main stock that will be thicker at the very bottom, at the very top where our blossom will be located, our side stock is not going to be thicker at the top. So we can simply set the radius to a thinner value already. And Charon, to get back to your question, this is about the kind of diameter that our final main stock is going to have at the very end. So we're going to reduce that. Yes. So let's also make this a little thinner even at the top. So I'll add a point and move that down to about 50%. And now our stock thins out nicely at the top. Regarding the biases, I think I'll actually change the strength to 20 plus minus 5. This is going to look strange at the moment, but this will look a little better once we edit our orange filter curve. So from our side stalks, we're going to make buds available. And I would like the bud to point towards the ground. So what I would like to do is to simply bend the upper 10% of our side stalk, and the rest should not be bent. So I'll uncheck local coordinates this time. And let's set the bending strength to 0 for most part. Let's rotate the plant a little. And let's zoom in and increase the bending strength over here. And I think I need to bend a little more than this. So let's move that forward. Oh, what was too much? Okay. So now we have a nice bend at the very top only of our side stalk. And now let's disconnect that side stalk. I'll call that side stalk again. And connect this to our main stalk as a new child. And now let's define the placement of these side stalks. So let's get back to the stalk, switch to the side stalk tab. And this time we will use a very nice feature that is very hidden in the application, but that allows you an unprecedented amount of control. So first, let's define the number of stalks that we want to grow out from here. Of course, I could simply do it as we did it before by entering a number here and something in here, but I would like to have more control, because if I enter 4 plus minus 2, I don't know whether PlantFactory will pick 2 children or 6 children. And I would like to have a variation of, how can I say that? I would like to have a positive variation only. So that orange area behind our white mean value of 4, I want to get rid of that. And for this, I will change the type of randomness to a custom distribution. So I'll do the left click and choose custom distribution. And now I will edit this custom distribution by going to edit variance. And so, as I said, I would like to get rid of that area completely. First, let's say the minimum number of stocks is 0, and the average amount of stocks is 1, and the maximum amount of side stocks that can grow out of the main stock is 2. And I would like TPF to choose only between 1 or 2 stocks and never choose a number of 0. So for this, let's use this curve and set it down to 0. So we now just told TPF, please choose a number of 0 to 0.99 with a probability of 0%. So we just eliminated this case in here. And I would like to make TPF pick one side stock more often than 2 side stocks. So let's set the probability of picking one side stock to 100%, and everything else should be of a lower probability, around 15 to 20%. So let's move this down and click OK. And now it's totally impossible that PlantFactory is going to generate 0 side stocks. It's highly likely that it's going to generate exactly 1 side stock, and it's a little less likely that it's going to generate 2 or 3 side stocks. So by using this custom distribution, you can actually influence the probability of TPF's random picks for each setting. This is an incredibly powerful feature, as you can imagine. Okay, next, TPF usually leaves a little border at the very bottom and at the top. So even if you say that something is allowed to grow up to the very end, to 100%, it will never be placed at the last millimeter or inch of something. There's always going to be a little invisible border. And this is what the borderless setting is for. I would like to remove this invisible border. So let's set this to borderless for the top and bottom. So in this case, TPF can truly place a side stock even at the very beginning or at the very top if we'd like to. And actually, I would still like to restrict the height where things can grow with the start and end settings, but due to the fact that we made this borderless, if we now enter a start value of 14% in here, it's truly 14% and not 14% plus X for an invisible border. So that's why I still set this to borderless. Let's add a little variation. And here I'd like to use an end of 0.28. That was a 0 too much. Okay. And again, the density filter is something that I would like to turn down so that we have more side stocks at the bottom of that area that we just created. So let's move this to about 14%. Okay. Again, the angle needs to be a little a lot steeper. So let's move that up to 80 degrees plus minus 10 for a little bit of variation. And let's coil our copies around our main stock by 30 degrees plus minus 15. Now, I would also like to have groups of side stocks instead of a single one. So again, let's check the Horal setting to create groups of these stocks. And again, I will make this, I will turn this into a custom distribution and edit this distribution. The min range is 0. The intermediate range is 1. And the max range is 2. And again, I would like to eliminate the probability for anything less than 1 per group. I would like to have a high probability for choosing one child and a lower probability for choosing more than one child. Okay, I think this concludes the placement of our side stocks, and just for the moment I'll be saving this as red copy webinar. Okay, I think it's time for a couple of questions. Are there any questions to the things that we just discussed?
Okay, any questions on the side stalks? Just to point out as well, I think if you want to raise an audio question, yeah, we'd love to hear your voice. If you've got a microphone, then raise your flag, and we can unmute you, and you could raise an audio question as well. So Mike says, I came in late. Will this be available later for viewing? Yes, it will. We'll sending you out a recording. Just make sure that you're registered for the webinar. And Karen's asking, why is the side stalk curved down?
You mean why it's pointing downwards?
Yeah.
It's because we added this direction in here, and I made the direction affect only the upper, what we have here, 11% of that side stock. And next up, we're going to place a bud in here. If we go back to that rendering that you can see here, then you will see what this is going to look like. So all the buds will be pointing downwards towards the ground, more or less. This is something that I made because of the reference pictures that I had. So I tried to imitate that. Okay, if there are no further questions, then I'd say let's continue with modeling our bud, which is going to be a lot faster than what we did with the side stalks and the main stalk. So the bud is only going to be placed on that side stalk. So again, let's add a new cylinder. And that cylinder is going to be placed on the side stalk. I'll call this bud. And this time we only want to have one copy, of course. And this copy is meant to be placed at the very tip of our side stock. So let's change the start to tip of the segment. Now you can see that PlantFactory actually just creates one single instance, and this is at the very top of or tip of our parent. So next up, we need to form this cylinder into something that resembles a bud a little more. So first, let's reduce the length to about 2.3 centimeters. And let's increase the radius to a fixed value. Yes, there will be hair and both leaves on the side stock. I'll connect these once we are done with the bud. Okay, so this is sort of the radius that we want for our bud, and now we need to deform our cylinder into something that is a little more round. And so for this, we're going to influence the strength of the radius by using our orange filter curve. And again, let's change this to a spline. That spline down to about this kind of value. And this looks good to me. Just need to make it like a little bit more irregular like this. Okay. And now we need to edit the tip of our bud. And for this, we have that cap option. So if you uncheck cap, you will see that the geometry or that former cylinder gets hollow on the top. And if you check cap, you will have closed geometry. And by editing the cap profile, we can now make this geometry rounded. So again, let's edit this cap profile and change this to a curve and move that curve upwards. And make this a little more rounded. Like this, I believe. Oh, maybe let's go a little higher. Yes, and we also need to increase the resolution of our bud because that's why we're not seeing that much of an effect of our filter. Yes. Now, by increasing the mesh resolution boost, we have a nice round bud shape. Actually, let me go back to that side stock and see whether we can activate some kind of blending between our bud and our side stock. So let's activate blending. That looks better. Then we just need to increase the resolution of our side stock accordingly so that the blending works a little better. Maybe we can decrease the resolution of the bud a little. Yes, so now we have a nice blend between our side stalks and our bud. So the next step will be to replace the material. So again, let's go to the materials group of our bud and load a new material. And where is it? There it is. And let's make this parametric. Or not? No. I think that's fine the way it is. Going to be low res anyways. We can still stretch this a little if we want to. So and maybe tile this a little more. No, I actually didn't plan for leaves around this connection. But of course, you could place leaves there. That wouldn't be a problem. From the reference pictures that I viewed, I actually didn't see any leaves directly at the bud. But it would be no problem to place leaves over there. So now we can connect our hair to our bud as well. And for the hair, let's see. We need to place this again at the surface of the segment to make it visible. And let's increase the number of children. Let's add a whorl to this. So this time I'm simply playing around with values. I didn't write them down because I thought it wasn't necessary. We can simply play around with it until we decide that it looks good. Maybe some more hairs and a little more coil, maybe not as much. I'm not sure if you can, yes, you can copy the values from the stock. So if we go to our stock and to the hair tab, I can click on any setting and say copy variance or variance, and let's go back to the bud and paste it in here. So you can copy and paste a couple of things, but I'm not sure whether that copies the number. I think it didn't. It might only copy the plus minus field in there. I don't think there's any faster way to do this, I'm afraid. Okay, but let's just assume that we are satisfied with our hair for now. And now I will connect the hair again to the side stalk. I didn't do this before because I wanted things to be a little more speedy. So now we have our hair back on our side stalk, and let's connect the leaf to the side stalk as well. And for the leaves, I need to make a few adjustments regarding the side stalk. So I don't want the placement to be exactly the same on the side stalk as on the main stalk, because this would mean that we have too many leaves on such a short type of geometry. So again, let's change the number of leaves to 2 plus minus 1. And let's start the leaves at a higher part of our side stalk, so about half of it, I believe. And let's end this around 75, 76%. The angle is fine. I just want things to be a little steeper at the beginning. So let's move that a little more upward so that the steepness is more consistent. And let's also use less leaves per group so that things don't get too crowded. Okay, so this is what our plant looks like for the moment. Let's generate a few variations and see what happens. Not too bad in my opinion. So now it's time to add all the details for the blossom, and then we will get back to adjusting our stalk and make it a little thinner. Let's save this in the meantime. Okay, we still have about 45 minutes left. I think that should be doable. Okay, so we are done with our side stalks. We're done with our main stalk for the most part. And we are done with our bud. So it's time for, to add that capsule, or whatever you'd like to call it, at the very top of our main stalk. So let's add a new geometry part. And I'll call this capsule. Apologies for the lack of correct biological vocabulary. I just named things the way that I, picture them. So our capsule should be placed at the very top of our stalk. So again, let's switch this to tip of the segment. And I would like to point it straight up. So let's set the angle to 0 degrees. So again, we will do similar things as with the bud. We're going to deform this straight cylinder into more geometrical shape. So first, let's set the length of that capsule to about 3/4 of a centimeter. I actually accidentally changed the length of the stalk. Okay, so yes, that looks better. Okay, so the radius is of course a little too thick. So let's change the radius to about 4 millimeters. And let's edit the radius again with our filter curve. And I'll change it to a spline, and then I'll move it down. Let's change the angle a little. And about half of the radius should be sufficient for the top. And maybe a point around here. Looks good. Yes. Something like this, and and an angle that is a little steeper. Okay, and I just realized that this was the shape that was meant for the cap at the top and not for the radius. Okay, so let's reset that filter, and I already copied it into the cap filter. And the radius shape that I want to produce is something like this. Move that down at first so that we start at a lower radius, and move this to a value around this, and maybe a little bit more to the right or to the left. Yeah, I think that's fine. Something like this, yes. Okay, and let's change the angle a tiny little bit at the bottom. And there we have our basic capsule shape. So again, to get a better idea of what this is going to look like, let's load the capsule material. And I would like to map this parametrically, I believe. Let's zoom out a little bit. And that was the wrong material, sorry. That's the correct one, and the one that I just loaded is something that we're going to use for the top of the capsule. Again, we can just add a few more polygons while we're working on this to get a better idea. And can also move this a little down. Yes, so now we have a nice center for our blossom. And next, we will add just a little bit more detail to this by adding a displacement map to the top of our cap. So for this, let's check the cap displacement group and load a displacement map, which is something that I painted in Photoshop. And let's increase the displacement amount a tiny bit. So it's hardly noticeable, but it's just a tiny bit of detail that will help in creating more elaborate shape. So you can see that if I exaggerate things, then we have a better, a stronger influence at the very top of our cap or of our capsule. Okay, so I believe this concludes the modeling of our capsule. And next up, we need to place a couple of seats around this center capsule. So let's turn off the wireframe for a moment and save this out. And now let's add a couple of seats. So up until now, all we used was that leaf node, which was that single polygon plane for the leaf, and cylindrical geometry that we deformed into different kinds of plant parts. And there are also nodes in PlantFactory that don't generate geometry by themselves, but they spread the things that you connect to them in different places. And this is what we're going to use now. In this case, we will need a Hydra object. So the Hydra object itself does not generate any geometry. Instead, it spreads things in a circle. So let's connect the Hydra as a new child to our main stalk. And nothing happens because it doesn't generate any geometry. I'll rename that tab to seeds, by the way. And I would like to place that invisible Hydra at the tip again of our segment. And let's reset the angle to 0. And now let's create sort of the stalk or stem of our seeds. So again, let's add an advanced segment. Let's call this seed stem. And let's connect this to the Hydra. And now we can clearly see what the Hydra object actually does. And we need to reduce the radius of our Hydra object. So right now it's set to 1 centimeter, so the diameter of that center is 2 centimeters. And we want the instances to be closer together. So let's reduce the radius to about 0.4. And let's increase the angle to about 70 degrees so that we get seed stems that are pointing upwards. Plus minus 10 maybe, so that they are not quite as irregular. And so we can increase the number of copies that the Hydra generates later on once we finished the construction of our seeds. So let's go to the seed stem for the moment. I'll give these nodes a different color, by the way, so that we can distinguish things a little easier in the graph. So let's color that side stalk in the same green as the main stalk. Let's give the bud another color, maybe yellow. And the seeds are going to be brownish in their texture, so let's use a brownish color. And immediately our graph is a lot more readable. Okay, so for the seeds, we first need to reduce their length to 1.5 centimeters plus minus a little bit of variation. And the radius is much too thick. Let's set the radius to about 1 millimeter. And I think we need a little bit of curl to make them not quite as straight. So let's activate a local bias. Let's use a curl. And the curl should only be very subtle. So let's do something like this. And it should happen in local coordinates along the y-axis. Okay, now we should activate the LOD management so that these things will not be generated for plants that are seen from far away. So let's set the maximum LOD to 2. So if I switch to the lower LOD, our seeds disappear. So they're only generated within the first 3 LODs. Okay, and finally we need a material. So let's load the material for our seed stems, which is again nothing special, just a very low-res texture, but these things are going to be a fraction of a millimeter in a scene, so I think we should keep things lightweight to make them load fast in every application. Of course, you're free to use high-res textures if you want to. Okay, so these are our seeds, and next we need to add sort of the seed head to this. So again, let's add a advanced segment called the seed heads and connect this to our seed stem. And we want this to grow from the top. So let's switch this to tip of the segment and use an angle of 20 degrees plus minus 15. Okay, so now we need to model our new seed heads into something that resembles seeds a little more. So let's copy our color. And first, let's reduce this to a more sensible length to about 2 millimeters at plus minus 0.05. Okay, the radius should be set to a fixed value again, not to an inherited one. Yes, okay. And so this looks a little more like seed heads. Again, I'll increase the resolution just while we're working on things. And now I'm going to show you an editor that we haven't used before, which is the section filter. So all we did prior was to use the radius filter to modify the cylinder into a specific shape. But the section filter actually allows you to create more irregular shapes. So by adding a few control points here and there, you can now model our seeds into a more elaborate shape. And so you can rotate this and take a look at this. And you can also click anywhere in here and add a new subdivisions for that geometry and move the points there to a different location, and this and TPF will blend smoothly between all the different kinds of shapes that you create. So this is great for gnarly trunks, etc. And in the case of our seeds, it just makes the shape a little bit more interesting than that default cylinder that we have. Maybe I should rotate the light so that we get a better view and highlight them. And let's subdivide the plant a little more. Yes, so here you can see the effect a little better. It's very subtle, but it's a nice detail for close-ups. And maybe you should adjust the material to be parametric and tile it around the U-axis a little more. Okay, this looks better in my opinion. And finally, we need to round off the cap of our seed heads. So again, let's edit our cap profile filter and make this just a tiny little bit rounded. Switch this to a spline. It's a little rounder. Now we have a nice rounded top on our seeds. And finally, let's load another material. And our seeds are basically finished. Let's zoom onto our top. And now we can increase the amount of seeds that we would like to have to a bigger number, to something like 200 plus minus 50. And we should decrease the resolution of our seeds again, because this was only for working on things during a close-up view. Okay, so we now finished the modeling of that capsule in the middle of our poppy flower, and we added seeds to all these things. And now it's time to start modeling the final and most interesting things, which are our petals for our poppy flower. Any questions?
Okay, any questions on that last section on the seeds, stems, seed heads, etc.? Okay, let's get into the petals.
Okay. So before we get into the petals, I'll save the scene out and create a new one to explain the flower node in a little more detail to you, so that you can understand a little easier what we're going to do. First, the flower node was added in release 5 of PlantFactory 2016. And basically, that's untrue. Yes. So basically what the flower node actually creates is a tube-like geometry. Let's zoom in a bit. And the flower node comes into the scene with a meta node attached to it. This meta node creates trumpet-like shapes. So you have the option to edit different settings to create these kind of filaments that you can see here. But this is not what we're going to use for our lesson today, so let's delete that meta node. And this is what the default flower node looks like. So as I said, it basically creates a tube, and you can specify the length of the tube by using that length setting. And you can specify the radius of the top of the tube, so the maximum radius, and the radius of the bottom of the tube by using that plug radius. And with plug influence setting, you can define where both radius settings are blended together. So if I increase the influence of the plug radius, then it has an influence that goes further up along the tube. And you can also edit the axis similar to what we did earlier directly in the 3D view with our segment node. So by using a couple of deformations in here, let's click apply, you can create quite elaborate tube structures. And you can also twist the tube. You can clearly see that on the geometry right now that that thing is twisted. And if you twist things, or if you have a very strongly bent axis, then you can sort of use this setting to counteract a geometry that is too distorted, or topology, because with strong axis settings, polygons can start to overlap. So this is sort of a smoothing out setting that you can use if your axis is bended in an extreme way. And the most interesting thing with that flower node is that you can actually create overhangs, and this works with editing the profile filter. So in here, you have a representation of the length of your tube. So the length of that curve always corresponds to the length that you enter in here. And if I move that down, you can see that it's possible to go back down on the axis of that geometry. And this is not possible with any other node. And so if I click and add a couple of new control points, you can see that it's very easy to create a lot of elaborate shapes. Mushrooms, Paul. Did you read my mind about what we're going to do tomorrow on the second day? We're going to be creating a mushroom generator tomorrow. That's something that we were talking about in the last webinar and that I didn't do. So I thought we'll tackle that tomorrow.
Yeah, a little bit of mind reading, I think, yeah.
Cloud City, yes, Christian. I wasn't thinking of Star Wars specifically. Okay, but this is the basic principle of what you can do with that flower node. So it can create really cool shapes that would be very difficult to do otherwise. The only downside is that you always have a thin tube, so you cannot create thick geometry. So if you would like things to revolve around this a little more, then you're out of luck. It's always going to be very thin. Yes, you should be able to change this profile over time with aging, Alex. What I would do for aging is I would extract this profile and copy this profile and create another one. So the first profile would be the beginning of the aging, the second one would be the end of the aging. And then I would blend both profiles together by using a blender node. And the blending ratio is actually controlled with the age filter. And then we will feed the blended output back into the flower node. And then you'd have a profile change over time with aging. You're welcome. Okay, so let's just reset that profile for a moment. And as you can see, if you reset it, then it's back to 0 and you get a disk. So this group is about handling normals. There's a button over here that lets you display the normals of your plant on your entire geometry. And so these are different ways of calculating the normals when a plant is exported to another application. So I guess this is more applicable for game engines. So it's not really something that we're going to tackle today. But the UV handling is something else. And so for the UV handling, you can select whether you want the texture to be applied on the circumference of the tube, which would be cylindrical mapping, or if you would like to have a top-down projection, which would be the disk mapping. To give you an example, let's load the poppy material that we're going to use in our poppy scene. And so with disk, basically, if we reduce the length, you can see that this is mapped from the top, just like plane mapping. And by changing this to disk, it's now mapped, with cylindrical mapping, basically. And so this is what we're going to use for our poppy. And you can define the number of petals by entering higher numbers in here. So by entering 3, then the texture is repeated 3 times around the circumference. So since there are various ways of creating flower petals, some of which we'll explore tomorrow, you might be wondering why I chose to use the flower node specifically for this project. I chose the flower node because I can easily create more than one petal, and this without making them overlap. Again, if you remember, I said that PlantFactory does not have collision detection, and there's quite a lot of variation in poppy petals. And so I thought, if I want to make sure that petals don't overlap, then it would be easiest to create 3 petals on a tube and then deform that tube altogether. This way we can avoid intersecting geometry. So as always, there is probably a million other ways on how you could achieve that poppy blossom, but I chose to use that tube-like approach due to the collision reason that I just mentioned. Okay, so let's get back to our poppy flowers so that we can finish the modeling of our project. So for the moment, I will choose the stalk and I will click that node, which means this the calculation of the stalk and everything that is connected to it will be disabled for the time being, because we want to focus on modeling the flower only. So let's add the flower node by going to geometry and adding the flower node. Again, we can delete the trumpet preset. Let's connect the flower node to our scene origin. So the first thing that I would like to do is to load the proper poppy material so that it's easier to visualize what we're doing. And let's switch the mapping to cylindric. Okay, now let's first set the length of this to 23 centimeters. And let's set the radius to 0.64. So if I zoom out, we can now see immediately that this resembles more the kind of wide petals, the wide and not narrow petals that a poppy flower has. So next up, we will need to change the influence of that narrow plug radius. So let's set the influence of that plug radius to 0. And the plug radius, sorry, that was the influence. Okay, so that our shape's only controlled by the radius setting that we indicate here and by the profile that we're going to edit now. So let's edit our profile. And these are going to be the inner petals. So if we switch back to that rendering, we can see that we have a group of outer petals and of inner petals. And the inner petals are pointing more upwards than the outer petals. So we will draw a profile that goes straight up. And so first, let's move this point to about here, I believe. And can I delete that point? Let's see. Yes, I just need to select it and click delete key point. And let's move this to our origin and create something similar to this. And click OK. So now we need more than one petal. So let's use 2 petals, and I believe, let me have a look. No, 1 is enough, actually. We need this one. Yes, that's correct. Okay, so this looks okay to me. And next up, let's take a look at our wireframe. And we would like to displace our tube to create more elaborate detail. And for this, we are going to create a procedural displacement. Let's call this inner petals, by the way. And color this red. And in order to displace this, we will use a fractal. So PlantFactory ships with all of the different noises and fractals that you know from Vue. And we need just a fast calculating fractal. So I'll use a simplified version of a fractal, which is the fast Perlin fractal. And so for the fractal, the largest feature should be around 1, because we want to have small detail. And let's increase the roughness a little. And now let's call this petal displacement. Copy that red color to our petal displacement. And now let's unfold our inner petals and go to the displacement mapping group and connect this to our displacement source. Now we need to actually activate the displacement mapping, and we need to increase the amount to about 40%. And as you can see, this looks rather strange. So we need to make sure that the displacement strength is only applied to the outside of our petals, so, or only very subtly at the inside. So let's increase the influence of the displacement at the outside, and let's decrease at the inside, and let's add a few more polygons. What we can see now is that we have a pretty nice looking inner poppy flower shape. And if we want to, we can still decrease the length a little and adjust the profile if we're not satisfied with it. The fact that the things in here are distorted is going to be masked later on by our capsule. So now it's time to actually connect our inner petals to our stalk. So let's disconnect the root and connect the inner petals with our stalk as a new child. Let's change the placement again to the tip of the segment. And I'll just have a look at whether we had an angle variation there. I'm not sure. What did I write down? No, nothing at all, but we're going to rotate this by about 90 degrees. And now we can activate our stalk again. And our petal is going to be probably much too tiny. Yes, we can't see anything at all. So let's go to the Transform tab and increase our global scale of that petal to a bigger value. And maybe we should decrease the subdivision of our plant altogether. Need for TPF to react again. Yes. Okay. And subdivide the plant a little more. So these are our inner petals, and we'll simply copy and paste our inner petals to create our outer petals. Let's again disconnect this for a moment and turn our stalk off so that we can focus on our outer petals, and this is the final element of our plant. So let's copy this, paste the color, call this outer petals. And for the outer petals, we don't need to make many changes, just a few ones. So we will change the length to something that's a little bigger, like this. And we will decrease the radius. I simply start on the root, Charon, because this is easier than having the entire plant visible at the moment. And in order to make something visible in the viewport, something in the scene needs to be connected to the root. So if I delete the connection, then the petals simply disappear. So once we are done with focusing on the outer petals, I will connect them to the stalk again. But it's easier to navigate with just the petals than with the entire plant. Okay, so yes, for the outer petals, we will change the profile filter. So we want this to be flat. So let's move this to something like this. And this is going to be a little more flat. Yes, and here we have our outer petals. Now, one thing that we want to have is we want to have the same amount of petals for the inside and the outside. So let's extract the number of petals here. So I'll click this and say connect parameter, call this number of petals. And let's just color this red again. And let's connect this also to our inner petals. So this is in the UV handling group, the angular mapping. And now I will click on this here and define this as a number between 3 plus minus 1. And I want TPF to instruct that TPF chooses the same variation for both. So I'll click on this and say new random value once per plant. If I didn't set this, then it might happen that TPF chooses a number of 2 for the inner petals and a number of 4 for the outer petals, for example. But now we define that this change should only be calculated once per plant and not for each individual child. And so finally, let's disconnect our outer petals from our root, connect them to our stalk, change the outer petals to be placed on the tip of the surface with an angle of 0, and let's turn on our plant again. And most of our poppy is finished. We actually need to decrease now the diameter of our stalk, which we will do right now. So let's get back to the stalk. And this time we will use the radius curve. So let's make the radius itself a little thinner around this one. And this is still not thin enough, so we'll employ an additional trick. We will go back into our section filter. And I will add another ring in here. And we'll bring that ring down to something around this. And bring that one up again. And move that all the way up here. Click apply. And now we have a nice thin stalk that gets thicker at the very top, where our petals are located. And as you can see, the petals are a little too low on our stalk, so we'll move them up by just increasing the offset a tiny bit. And there we are. Most of our flower is now finished. There's actually one more change that we're going to do tomorrow. And this is that we want our petals to be less straight. Currently, they're pointing up again. And since the flower node doesn't have influences such as curl or direction, we will need to find a way to build different axes for creating randomness to our petals. And so we will create a meta node tomorrow, which will bend our petals into different axis directions. So as a final result for today, let's save this out and create a couple of variations to see what our plant looks like. I'll just unsubdivide the plant a little because it takes a while to generate. And maybe we need to work a little more on the inner petals. I think they're a little too narrow, but this might change once we have our random axis in place. But this is what we ended up with today. And so I think with a couple of final tweaks to the petals tomorrow, we can finish this project, and we will then look at other types of petal creation. We will save out parts of our poppy flower that we're going to reuse tomorrow, and I'll show you how quickly you can then generate new species by just exchanging the textures and the blossoms. So we will create at least one or maybe even two other kinds of flowers by using different techniques than the flower node. We will use blades and urchins tomorrow. And then I plan on having a little fun with you by creating a mushroom generator. So we will dive a little bit deeper into more intricate dependencies, and we will create a published interface and create different presets so that we can switch between different kind of mushrooms on the fly, all in the same scene. And these presets will also be loadable in Vue. So I'd like to conclude today's session with a final question and answer round. I can see that we have a couple of questions in the chat box. I'll just scroll up and have a look at them.
Yes.
Okay, Charon, you say they have 4 to 6 petals. All right. Would be easy to adjust. So we can say 5 plus minus 1. And now we have petals with poppies with 4 to 6 petals. So it's just the change of a number. Having flowers pointing towards a light source. Yes and no. You cannot add a light source as an object into the scene. All you have is that scene light over here that represents the sun for taking a look at your flower from different lighting angles. But there is a tropism setting in many nodes, which you can use to make the plant bend always towards the sky. So unless you're not referring to a specific kind of light source, then yes, there's a way to make plants bend upwards into the sky. Okay, so if you want to have them opposite Charon, then this is an easy change as well. We just need to go to our stalk and choose orthogonal alternate for our leaves. And if we simply remove the coil, then we have our leaves alternate on each side, opposite of each other. So let me just deactivate our side stalk so that we get a better view. So now we have opposite leaves. So what we were modeling wasn't necessarily botanical correct, I know, but I tried to give you more of an artistic workflow. And you can, of course, always change every kind of option to make things botanically correct.
Yeah, Charon, thank you for your botanical input today. It's been really useful. So if everyone can give Daniel a big thank you for the session today. Lots of detail, lots of insights into using PlantFactory in a very intricate way, and a couple of editors that I can't remember seeing before. So there's been extra depth today.
Yes, definitely. I try to incorporate different techniques in the project so that you can see different approaches on how you can tackle things, and we'll get going to see a bit more of that tomorrow.
Yeah, so same webinar room tomorrow and starting at the same time. We'll see you then. Take care.
Thanks guys for the compliments. I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a nice evening.